the same DNA. A multinational development bank and a public national development bank are all development banks to start with. We have very different roles, very different capabilities, but the true incentives that drive us are actually all the same. And I think it's a very empowering message for some of the national development banks that are still finding their space in their own development agenda. BRD was one of the lucky ones because we got a very clear mandate from our government when it comes to the green transition. A choice was made by a government not to create a new bank, but to use the existing National Development Bank to deliver on the green and climate resilience agenda. And it speaks to what Remy was just mentioning, which is very often the means are here. We don't have to go very far. But we need to give power to the means, mandate to the means, and finance to the means, as mentioned by President Adesina. So as a development bank of Rwanda, we've actually benefited tremendously from Finance in Common, not only because it's a place where we get indeed knowledge, connections, networks, but it's also actually, for us, it worked as a marketplace. So we managed to close some very successful transactions and strengthening the partnership between the MDBs and the multinational development banks and the National Development Bank, in this case, BRD. And very concretely, from one Finance in Common to another, we actually managed to partner with EIB and AFD and the Swedish government to get a very innovative facility called Ireme Invest, which is dedicated to access to finance for the private sector. So it's an all-in instrument that is very innovative. And what struck me is when we came up with the idea of Ireme, we knocked at many doors. And I think we can be quite open. We knocked at some of the funds that were so-called dedicated to climate. But the institutions that heard us quicker and could get the concept and help us operationalize in record time was a multinational development bank. And I think it's not by accident. It's because we share the same DNA and they understood immediately what we're trying to achieve. So we had the pleasure of launching this platform yesterday with the President of the Republic, President Kagame, and with Remy and Ambroise and our colleagues from the British government. But I wanted to make that point because I think often we look at Finance in Common as a summit, but it's more than a summit. It's actually a platform where we're able to close deals, we're able to deepen relationships, and we're able to create the networks that allow us to do innovative things. So just to re-emphasize, as Remy has said, where's the pipeline going to come from? This is our daily bread. As a national development bank, we know the projects, we know the actors on the ground, we know who has an appetite to create green assets and who doesn't. We know how to close the deals at the local levels to have the impact that can be reported at the global level. So Finance in Common for us, as you rightly said, is really a platform of choice because we've managed to achieve all these objectives in one particular network or in one particular platform. So I'll stop here, but just to say, I really appreciate the fact that this platform gives a voice to the National Development Bank and allows us to show that, you know, national development banks are not dirty. We can also be very high performing, with high corporate governance. We are financially sustainable. We make a little bit of profit. We're able to deliver the impact and to show that we have done the work to reform ourselves to be partners of choice for multinational development banks and other actors. Thank you very much.
That's right, and you know, and public banks are very much legitimate players in the system. And I think it's very interesting what you say about the mandate. You got that green mandate from your government. And if you think about it, the same's true of EIB. They got their mandate to become a climate bank, you know. AFD, just after the Paris Agreement was signed, got its mandate from the French government to mainstream, to be 100% Paris aligned. So now I want to ask you, Patrick Dlamini, the CEO of the Development Bank of South Africa, what do you find so special about this Finance in Common initiative? What do you see in terms of the future going forwards? And what would you like to see the 500 public banks come together to do on adaptation, on energy transition, on agricultural transition as well, in terms of to harness the power of the 2.3 trillion per year that these banks mobilize? Patrick.
Thank you. What? Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Program Director, and thank you to our chairman at IDFC, Mr. Remiru. Thank you to my dear sister and colleague, Campenda Zonzionga. Really, it is quite an honor to be here. I'm glad that my big brother from AFD and AIB, they decided to run away because you always leave the best for last. So Raphael decided to get off stage very quickly. But really, it is a very crunch time for the world in terms of us stepping up the game and making sure that the public development banks, as you're saying, 550 and counting, it really says, as in the coalition in finance in common, it says it's an amazing platform that brings us together as public development banks to make sure that we are able to share our experiences and to make sure that we are able to collaborate as public development banks across the world and giving meaning to the SDG 17 for partnership in tackling the issues of just transition and the issues of sustainable development. And really we have done quite a lot even with AFD. We issued a green bond in South Africa last year, and we are actually doing quite a number. But what is critical is that as the public development banks, we have then to start looking at how do we then get to share our expertise as we are moving into the just energy transition phase, because it is no secret that in many emerging markets, you have the issue of capacity that is not where it's supposed to be. When I talk about capacity, I'm talking about technical expertise for people to try and structure these projects to make sure that they really specifically and well articulated to talk to the just transition. We also have the issue of personnel expertise that are required to make sure that even in terms of both technical expertise as well as negotiation internationally, because remember, the just energy transition speak to the developed north supporting the developing south. This then says we have international engagements. How much negotiation skills and expertise do we have in emerging markets to engage on such complicated deal making with the north? But also, it also says we then also need to start saying how then as public development banks do we go beyond just equity instrument and debt instruments and look at many other credit enhancements and guarantee instruments to make sure that we make what would otherwise not be possible. Because a well-structured deal is a function of how much did you put into the pre-investment phase to really crystallize and spell out the economics of the projects and identify the risk and then come up with mitigation measures so that it works for the country, it works for the poor communities as well. Because this talks to the vulnerable communities. How do we make sure that we are also inclusive in these engagements? You have civil society, you have governments, you have labor, you also have communities that you have to engage, and businesses in terms of the private sector, to make sure that you are able to collectively drive these just transition deals, to make sure that they do not only cater for climate, but they also make sure that they speak to biodiversity and nature, because people and nature have got to coexist. You will never find people without nature. So we need to make sure that our nature is also sustainable. So we have to pay very much important attention to that. But the SDR is absolutely critical, because as we speak, we are now on the cusp of global economic recession. How then do we make sure that many of these countries still have capacity to do more deals? How do we make sure that these deals are also done without headrooms in terms of the central fiscus? Because some of the funding requires a sovereign support and sovereign guarantees. We do not have much headrooms available. But how then do we bring about guarantee schemes to make sure that we are able to create the requisite headrooms to ensure that then the possibility of funding new deals, especially in the light of the Just Energy Transition Partnership, becomes possible. But it is something that is doable, but public development banks have a really, really strong role to play, and we have to really start looking at how do we lead the charge as the public development banks to make sure, and partnering with our international partners, as well as engaging with multilateral development banks, to make sure that the just energy transition becomes a very meaningful and truly just in terms of the vulnerable communities, because we cannot afford to leave anyone behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to, talking of the private sector, I'd like to invite Eric Usher from the UNEP Finance Initiative to come and take a seat, as he will be concluding this event in a minute. But just before we do that, Amy, I'd like to turn to you, because this question of the SDRs, of the IMF special drawing rights, what is the challenge? Why are they not already being channeled to the MDBs, to the bilateral DFIs, to the public banks like the DBSA, or even direct to the Just Energy Transition Partnership via some vehicle? How can we unlock that political knotty problem and unleash that new wave of capital for the green transition?
Well, there are legal questions on the nature of SDR. Are they to stay liquid, or can be mobilized as some sort of asset on the bank's balance sheet? And there are different views on that. But I think there were a lot of technical works for a year now. There were also decisions taken decades ago allowing many multilateral development banks to manage SDR. So my personal view, and I think that of President Macron, is we certainly have to explore very seriously this possibility, because it's the only one I know that has a leveraging capacity. I mean, if we don't want to have only one SDR, meaning $1 of investment, you have to go through the multilateral development banks. And if you transfer these resources to local public development banks, then you only demultiply the collective capacity. So at least I would say that this is a good debate. If not SDR, could be other resources. I mean, it helps our leaders consider the architecture as a whole. And also donors are beginning to understand that they can choose to leverage our collective or individual balance sheet more and more. When this world of public banks was so fragmented, I mean, before that, everybody forgot that this is a macroeconomic issue, actually. This is a consolidated, it can really help, and I just wanted to add two comments. The first one is climate and SDGs are the starter. They ignited what we're doing. And this is what Competa said, saying we have the same DNA. Deeply, we received the new mandate in 2015. And what was impossible before is now is now happening, and on top, of course, of this mandate is climate. And and certainly there's a feeling of hope, a feeling of this coalition of doers can provide part of the answer. When you add the 80 billion of MDBs we were referring to with the 220 that IDFC originated in 2021, well, we have already $300 billion. So 3 times the 100 billion of Copenhagen. Of course, very different. It's not to deny the climate justice dimension, but just to give an indication of what climate finance post-2025 could be. I mean, in terms of scale, in terms of coalition, in terms of friendship, in the end. And my second remark is just to, and the JET-P in South Africa. I mean, first movers are the public banks, of course. So you know we signed our first concessional loans, KfW and AFD, for 600 million euro before COP27, so soon to be disbursed. We could add to that, I think, $500 million that the World Bank is doing. Also, it's not within JET-P, but of course, it's part of this, the support to the South African policy on this. And my point is, of course, the BSA is part of this. The China Development Bank is part of this. IDC is part of this. And again, if we join forces, I'm certain that we can make a true and real contribution to the just transition in South Africa and elsewhere. And last point, just to say that finance in common, of course, this is the place we were waiting for. This is our place, but it's also an open place where we accept to contradiction, we accept science. So we were very proud in Abidjan to publish 18 policy papers, including one from E3G. And this research conference was fascinating, I mean. And the database that we have produced with the University of Peking, I mean, is the heart of finance in common. No? And it gives the opportunity to all stakeholders, including civil society, private sector, well, to challenge the group. and this is where we are. And I'm pretty sure that collectively we will find a way to do right proposals for our leaders. Thanks.
And you mentioned ECG research. I can say that next week we are publishing an assessment of you, of AFD, of how Paris-aligned you are or not. And I can give you a sneak preview. It's you get the thumbs up. Patrick, I want to ask you one quick yes-no question. South Africa has a just energy transition partnership. Would you recommend it to other countries? Yes or no?
Hello. It is a big yes, and it will serve as a great learning platform.
Perfect, good. So everyone else in the room, get your JET-P soon. I want to, as a concluding statement, I want to turn to Eric. Eric Usher, he's the head of the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, to give us the perspective from the private sector, because in a sense, the theory of change, soi-disant, is if we can get this 10% of the global financial system represented by public banks to move, it moves the rest of the private financial system. So Eric, I'm interested in hearing your perspective on what you think the consequences of all this is for the members of your initiative, for the work that you're involved in with GFANS, for you know, how can we use everything the public banks are doing to catalyze change across the entire global financial system. Eric, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. And with Remy and team, we have been talking about this notion of alignment for a long time. It's something that's true to our hearts. And when we talk about an aligned financial system, you have different actors in that system. And what we hope is that they're all working in a similar direction. Now, we're not all using the same methodologies. We don't have all the same access to the data, but we have a willingness to try to work together. And what I'll talk about now is, UNIP-FI, we are the convener of 3 of the alliances under GFANZ, specifically the Asset Owner Alliance, which was the first one, the Insurance Alliance, and the Banking Alliance, which is the biggest. And I'm going to give some comments about, when I think about alignment, if we talk about the capital markets, so I would say the investors who are really engaged in this space, the PDBs, and commercial banks. And one form of alignment is how do you get capital from the capital markets through PDBs to commercial banks, to the actors on the ground, to the communities, to the corporates and others. And so just a couple reflections on what we're seeing, and I think in the opportunities to tune up that relationship. And I guess what I'd like to come to when we think about finance in common, we believe that the private sector needs to be part of that. And how do we create, the positive energy that's been built, that's brought together the 500 PDBs? Let's create the portal or the engagement about how we bring in the private actors. Now, you're already doing that. What we're looking is to say, how do we put that up to a systemic scale relationship? So I'm going to talk about let's talk about the investors first. So the asset owners, it's a group under GFANZ. It's 75 investors today. They account for just over $10 trillion of assets. So it's how you measure. Maybe it's about 20% of asset owner community. They've set 2050. Everybody has that. The interim target is the question. They're actually the only group under GFANZ to set 2025 targets. They started earlier. They've been going at it for a couple of years. And you can find their reports online that basically say, how are we going to deliver 2025 targets that are aligned with the science, so based on IEA or based on IPCC, that are credible, and what does it mean for our different asset classes? Now, in certain areas, we have the methodologies. We can set already specific targets. In other areas, we don't even have methodologies yet, so we need to work together. One area they're working on now is sovereign bonds. How do you look at that within a net zero context? But they've done a lot of work in public equities, in fixed income markets. One of the areas they are working is in climate finance solutions. So this group of investors, so far they have $250 billion invested in the climate solutions. So that's renewables, or that's the far end of the spectrum. Out of that 250 billion, 60 some is in green bonds, and a good portion of that is buying the bonds of from the development community. And so I think there's a first relationship there in terms of a dialogue between an engaged investor and a development bank who basically has a set of intentions. How do we put that to play? Now let me shift to the role of commercial banks. Because I think, investment is very important, big projects are very important, but we have to realize that as this transition really gets going, the interface, the decision interface will be big deals, where you have a group in the room, get the deal done, but it'll be millions of small, tens of millions of small deals, which are basically done between a bank manager and their client, being a SME, being a corporate, being a household, so essentially, how do you get the entire financial system who are able to essentially talk about this transition? Now, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, so it's the banks within GFANZ, tomorrow they will put out their progress report, and you will find in it 63 of the banks have already issued their preliminary targets, and you can get an idea of their intentionality in different sectors. I'll take the power sector. That's the biggest number of banks have set targets there. The targets on average are 54% reductions in emissions, not by 2025, they can't get it done then, but by 2030. So if you take a typical bank, it could be a Standard Chartered, Barclays, but it also could be Kenya Commercial Bank, CIB here in Egypt, First Abu Dhabi Bank. These are all who are net zero committed. And you can see how are they going to get those reductions. So you can imagine if you're a big global bank, you have a commitment over 50% reductions in 8 years' time. Where are you going to get that? Where is a lot of new build needed? It's going to be in developing countries. And so, and I take Standard Chartered, they have a $300 billion commitment to climate finance. You know Standard Chartered, where do they operate? Within the developing world. So you can imagine the scale of mitigation action that they're expecting to do, basically renewables being a big destination. There will be some pulling away from coal, for instance, and other. There'll be real estate, there'll be steel sector, but you get the idea of this scale. Now this group of NESBA players, it's $70 trillion globally, but it includes $6 trillion of investments in developing countries. So if we can move 5%, 10% of that, it's at a scale that can meet the PDB community and essentially take it to a systemic level that we can do the transition. Last point, I think, as everybody knows, adaptation and resilience, the private sector is not up to it yet. There's a lot more that needs to be done. It's one area there needs to be a lot more emphasis. We need a race to resilience. There are a lot of promising startups, but there's a lot of work to be done there. I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you. That brings us to the end of our event. I want to say thank you to all of you for joining. Thank you to everyone who watched online as well. I just want to end by saying, you know, this is a very powerful group of institutions. These are policy-driven public banks. If you want to find out more about what many of them are doing on climate change, have a look at the E3G website, E3G Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix. We do in-depth analysis of these banks on climate change. We've discussed SDRs, we've discussed the mandates given to these banks, we've discussed the need for long-term strategies for Paris alignment. So lastly, I just want to leave you with this picture of us all with this same DNA, holding hands, dancing around this baobab tree, and working together as one community to deliver not just on the climate challenge, but on all global public goods. And I want to encourage you all to come to Finance in Common 2023 next year in Latin America. We don't know where yet, right? Do we know where yet? Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, who knows? But there we will dance together, vamos a bailar todos juntos, to continue this journey together. So see you in Latin America next year. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.